Okay, guys, this is Chapter 6, Video C. So we are going to pick up with objective number 10, and we're going to finish the chapter. So please make sure that you have your Chapter 6 notes in front of you as well as your Chapter 6 objective. So number 10 says, describe fermentation to include the energy yield of the process. Define lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation. So this is an anaerobic way of getting energy. Anaerobic means without air or without oxygen. So it's going to allow cells to still make ATP even though there's no oxygen present. So, and that's important because sometimes our cells run out of oxygen. So fermentation comes in to allow them to continue making energy until oxygen is replenished. So under anaerobic conditions, again, that means without air, without oxygen, mussels, yeast, and some bacteria can make ATP by glycolysis. So the NAD is recycled from NADH as pyruvate, and it's reduced to either lactate, which is the product of lactic acid fermentation, or alcohol and CO2, which is the products of alcoholic fermentation, okay? So fermentation is a way to still make ATP even though we have no oxygen. And there's two types, lactic acid and alcoholic. So with this, the process of fermentation starts with glycolysis. So if you remember, glycolysis didn't require oxygen in the cells. It was the only step that doesn't require oxygen. But we did get 2 ATP from that. Now, after glycolysis, it depends on whether the cell has oxygen or not. If the cell does have oxygen, it's going to go on to stage 2 of cellular aerobic respiration that we just talked about in the first 2 videos, or if there's no oxygen present, it's going to go into fermentation and yield 2 ATP. So that's the energy yield for fermentation. So you can obviously see we get a whole bunch more with cell respiration, aerobic with oxygen, than we do with fermentation. Now, lactic acid fermentation takes place in the muscle cells when, usually during intense exercise, when your cells need a lot of ATP, it's high, but the blood can't get oxygen fast enough, or there's not enough oxygen there. So lactic acid fermentation kicks in as a way to keep you going. And lactic acid or lactate is the byproduct, and this is what causes your muscles to be sore the next day or the next couple of days. So lactate is a chemical that is going to cause pain in your muscle cells, but it's a way for you to continue with your exercise or whatever you're doing until there's oxygen replenished, to keep you going. The best way, by the way, just a little FYI, to get rid of lactic acid and get rid of muscle soreness is to work out the next day. A lot of people just don't do anything because it's painful, but the cell has to break down lactic acid, and the only way to do that is to speed up the metabolism, and the way to speed up cell metabolism is by exercising. So it actually makes your soreness go away a lot faster. And then the second type is alcoholic fermentation. This is used by yeast and some bacteria. Probably heard of fermenting, yeast fermenting. That produces carbon dioxide and ethanol. Now, the ethanol is used to make alcoholic beverages as well as the CO2. That's kind of the bubbles in beer and wine. And then also it's how we get bread. Yeast cell rises and produces CO2 bubbles, and this is, how we get bread. So these fermentation are ways that we get a lot of some of the foods and drinks that we use, but it also has a lot of different applications, like, for example, in muscle cells. But it's a way to get energy without oxygen, okay? You just don't get nearly as much energy. So if we take glucose, this is, we go through glycolysis, so we end up with 2 pyruvates, 2 ATPs, 2 NADHs. The pyruvates go through lactic acid fermentation. We recycle those back, and we end up with 2 lactates, okay? And then with alcoholic, again, start out with glucose, go through glycolysis, break it into 2 pyruvates. We get our 2 ATPs, our 2 NADHs. We recycle those back. The 2 pyruvates release carbon dioxide and 2 ethanol. All right, so that would be the alcoholic fermentation. And this is just, an image in your book showing the wine barrels and then the beer fermenters. Okay? We'll watch this together in class, that overview. And then finally, we get to a connection between the metabolic pathways. So your cells have to use a lot of different kind of organic molecules as fuel for respiration. Most of your calories come from carbohydrates, sucrose, which is table sugar, starch, polysaccharide. Y'all know we eat a lot of starches, anything white, potatoes, rice, all those things that are white are starches. We also get calories from fats and proteins. So the cell can use these three types of fuels to make ATP: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Now, typically a cell is going to burn carbs first, then it'll move to fats, and then lastly proteins. Proteins are not really what you want to use for fuel. They're mainly used to make enzymes. I mean, they can be used, but typically the body, or most all the time, the body's going to use carbs and protein or fats first, then it'll protein if it has to. There are some foods like peanuts that give you all three of these: carbs, fats, and proteins. So this is cool just to see the different color arrows. This is on page 126 in your book. But you can see the carbohydrates, which are sugars. That'll give us glucose, which will go straight into glycolysis, pyruvate, Krebs cycle, citric acid, and then oxidative phosphorylation. Fats give us glycerol fatty acids that can, of course, jump in at either of these stages. And then proteins can also jump in at all three of these stages as well. So kind of cool that there are some foods that actually give us all three types of fuel sources, not just one. Okay, and that, is the same thing there, showing you a little bigger. Okay. Now, ultimately, remember that ATP is needed to drive all biosynthesis. You got to have ATP for all these stages, for citric acid, making acetyl-CoA, glucose synthesis, taking all of that. So we get all the raw materials from all these processes from food, all right, which is why got to have food in order for any of this to take place. Okay, it's mandatory, to eat. This is just a review. That concludes objective number 11, by the way, which was explain how carbs, fats, and proteins are used for fuel. So this is a review of the chemical equation for cell respiration. Again, we start out with glucose and oxygen. Those are reactants, and we yield, that's what arrows mean, is yield or produce, carbon dioxide, water, ATP, and of course we lose some heat. Okay. Now we're going to do this in class together. This is a really cool concept map. We have to fill in all these blanks about cell respiration. So we will work on that together. Of course, you can pause the video now and work it out before we get to the class, and then you'll be able to check your answers when we meet together. All right, guys, that concludes chapter 6.